Before we jump into today's lesson, I'd just like to note that I did just upload our first oil painting lesson on the channel. Go check it out and make sure that you hit the bell button on YouTube to ensure that you get notified every time we upload. Going to start uploading much more on this channel throughout the week, so make sure you don't miss a thing. Click that bell button, sign up to the newsletter, and stay up to date with all of the great new content. With that said, let's jump into it. Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting lesson. Today we are going to be painting on a black canvas. Now it's important to note it did not come black. I purchased a regular white canvas, I painted it black, and I let it fully dry. From there, to start this painting, I grabbed a damp, medium-sized, round-headed brush and a mixture of titanium white and primary blue. I then began to apply this pigment where my moon is going to be. Now, I didn't begin by painting the actual moon. Instead, I'm going to paint the glow from the moon first. So I started with that fairly neutral blue. It's a fair mixture of primary blue and titanium white. Then I grabbed a slightly brighter mixture, this time with slightly more titanium white, and I'm applying that in the center of that first application. Then I'm blending one into the next. Now the blend itself isn't a conventional blend. It isn't a soft gradient, one void of brush strokes. This time I'm using small little strokes with my brush, as you can see here in this next application. And what I'm doing here is I'm trying to create a little bit of motion. I'm trying to make it a little bit more dynamic and interesting. You could create a very flat sky with a square-headed brush. It's a perfect rendering and gradient, and that works in a lot of contexts. But this one, I wanted the sky to really stand out and be a little bit more captivating. So I'm moving my brush in these round strokes and kind of just following the glow of the moon. Right now, I'm applying a very dark mixture of blue around those first two applications. It is a mixture of Mars black, primary blue, and titanium white. Very small amount of titanium white. That's really just to thicken the pigment and also to desaturate it slightly. But as you can see, I'm going back around and I'm connecting those three pigments together. Now, it's important to note that when you're applying this third darker mixture and you're moving in towards the brighter mixtures, ensure that it's really starting to dissipate and that you don't have a lot of that dark pigment on your brush, as you can easily overtake that brighter center that we have. Now, from there, I'm going to start expanding outwards with this darker pigment. I'm working it around the trees, and this is worth noting. I'm currently using a round-headed brush. A round-headed brush is great because it has very feathered edges, so it can create very soft applications, things with gradients and areas that dissipate. So things like clouds, mist, fog, all of these things that should have much more soft edges, it is fantastic for. But generally, when I work around sharper edged subjects like trees, I like to use a square-headed brush, either the large or the small square-headed brush. And that's generally what I'd advise, but because we are working on the background and we're going to be going over those trees again, I opted for the round-headed brush. But I just wanted to bring it up because it's important to be cognizant of what brush you're using in which scenario and why you're using it. So generally, when you're working on a sharper subject in the foreground, use a square-headed brush. When you're working on a softer subject or something in the background, use a round-headed brush. Now, from there, I'm taking even more of my bright pigment, I'm applying it back into the center, and I'm blending it out yet again. As you can see, we have the brush strokes, it's a little bit more dynamic, and I'm using a very soft application with my brush. I don't want to peel any of the paint off the canvas. Acrylics can be fairly transparent, and if you apply a lot of pressure with a light pigment over a black canvas, sometimes you can pick up that pigment and you'll see that black canvas showing through. So be careful with that. In the very bright areas, at least in the initial layers, use a very small or very minuscule amount of pressure with your brush. Now, from there, as you saw, I just applied some stars to the sky. We will be doing more of that in the very near future in this painting, but I essentially just took some water, some titanium white, I added it to a very small round-headed brush, I peeled back the bristles, and I launched it at the canvas. I did this because it renders so many stars so quickly. It saves a lot of time, and it creates stars of different sizes, some of which so small that you wouldn't be able to create with a natural application of a tapping brush stroke. So you save a lot of time, you create a lot of diversity in your stars, so it's interesting, and you also achieve things that you couldn't naturally with a regular brush stroke. I then added some water down into the base of the painting. I used a medium-sized square-headed brush. I used a fairly neutral blue, something very similar to what we used initially for the glow. And I used the square-headed brush because it does have those nice sharp edges for the line work and the reflection. Now, from there, speaking of square-headed brushes, right now I'm using an older square-headed brush, one where the bristles kind of leaf off in varying directions, so when you make a dabbing motion with it, you get a bunch of different implications on your canvas. It saves a lot of time and it makes sure that it's always interesting and evolving. You can make one of these very easily by taking a square-headed brush, peeling back the bristles until they kind of leaf off in varying directions, and then with this tapping motion, as you can see, I'm creating all of these little implications on the canvas. I'm creating foliage. This is going to be for the cherry trees in the background, in the foreground, and I'm using a very dark purple right now. This is a mixture of primary red, primary blue, and some Mars black. And I'm going to build up to the highlights in my painting. So that was my first layer. It was my dark application. Now I'm adding in my middle application. Now, we're going to slowly add up the highlights on these, and it's going to build depth. Right now, the moon is going to be shining down on this area, and so the tops of these trees are going to be catching light. Then as we move downwards in the trees, there's going to be less light cast upon it, and there are more branches over top creating shadows, so it's going to get darker and darker, begin to dissipate more. So that's really what we're trying to do. Around the edges of our trees, the areas that are closest to the moon, we're applying a fair amount of this mid-tone. And then with a tapping motion, we blend backwards, we allow it to dissipate on our brush, we allow it to blend more into the darker pigments, and we get this gradient from a mid-tone to a dark tone. And that's really what's going to create depth in your painting. The more variations of tones and values that you create within this application, the more interesting and real your painting is going to look. So generally what I would advise if you are a beginner, if you are just starting, aim for a darker tone, aim for a middle tone, and aim for a highlight. If you add all three of those to each subject, you should have a subject and a painting with a lot of depth. So with that said, we just did that to the foliage. Here we're going to do that to the tree itself. So I'm taking a bit of burnt umber with a bit of titanium white in it as well, and I'm just drawing on the edges of the branches that are going to be closest to the moonlight, because they are going to be the brightest and the light is going to wrap around that side of the tree, getting darker as it gets to the opposite side of the tree. You can do this with a bit of a blend, and if you want a lot of texture in your tree instead of a very flat, clean looking tree, you can do this with a tapping motion and it'll create a lot of bark with the smaller square-headed brush. We are using the smaller square-headed brush because it does have those sharp edges, and it's going to create this very fine detail in the tree like we like. Here I'm also creating smaller branches as we get upwards in the tree. Make sure that your branches are always branching off, no pun intended, that they are always evolving and changing. You don't want two sections to look exactly the same. That can be a little bit boring, it can be a little bit too cartoony. Some of these scenes can be a little bit surreal, but you don't want to create two rocks that look the same, two trees that look the same, two sets of branches that look the same. It can just be derivative quickly. So with that in mind, just try to ensure that your painting is always evolving and changing. Now, something else to note, I am fully aware and cognizant that we have not painted the moon in yet. I'm letting the background dry fully before I apply that. That way it doesn't blend in with the background and I get much more of a proper stark pigment that I actually want. So speaking of that, here I'm finally going in and beginning that process. I added some titanium white. I blended it out with my finger to get a very soft glowing effect, and I'm just kind of going back and doing this a couple of times until I build up to the value in the glow that I really want. Then I'm going to hold my canvas. I'm probably going to hold my breath actually, just to calm my body and ensure I can really work with a lot of detail. And I'm going to draw in the moon, starting with the edges, and then I will create little areas in the moon that will also have those highlights. Going to leave some of the areas slightly darker for areas like craters and different things like that. It'll just make it look much more multi-dimensional and interesting. Here I'm also throwing a couple of additional little stars into the background with the brush. We got most of them in with our initial application, but here we can definitely do a couple of extra ones and create something fairly interesting. I'm also adding a little bit of a highlight into the water with that titanium white from the reflection. Then I'm adding a little bit more highlight into the tree as well. So here now we have the darker application, we have the midtone, and we have the highlight. Waited to add the highlight because I didn't want it to blend in too much with the midtone, but really there it is. That is our 10-minute version of the painting. It's more of the spring version, but if you want something where it's more fully in bloom, I thought I'd show you that too. So this is maybe a little bit later in the season. It's a little bit more detailed. It's a little bit more advanced. Here I'm adding in an extra highlight. So we have our dark tone, our mid-tone, our highlight, and then another highlight on top of that, just to make it really pop and be much more interesting. Then I'm also throwing some additional highlights down into the water for the reflection of our moon. It's going to give it a really beautiful look, and the more highlight you add into that middle area, the better it will be. Try to allow it to dissipate on both the right and the left hand side, blend into the rest of the water, and you'll get something really nice. Then I went back in, I added in some additional stars. That can be a little bit risky as it can be difficult to direct them, but if you get close enough to the canvas, you should be good. Then I added some additional highlights to the edges of the trees with a tapping motion, built up some texture, built up some highlight, and created a lot of depth. But essentially, there we have it. There is our 10-minute version, our 13-ish minute version. I truly hope you've enjoyed. I hope you feel like you've learned something. If you'd like to learn more, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. It teaches you about how to blend with water, teaches you about how to mix your paints, what brushes to use, all of the things you need to know before you jump in to your first painting. I also have my second ebook, Painting Prompts for Beginners. It's essentially 21 digital sketches for when you don't really know what you want to paint that day, but you want to create something, you want to practice and get better. With that, you just pick out a drawing, a sketch. They have gridded versions, and you go to town with it. Also, you can get my hour-long lessons over on Patreon. They're just like these, but you also get to see my color palettes when we're blending, all of the things we don't have time for in these lessons. Anyways, with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching. I truly hope you've enjoyed. I hope you feel like you've learned something. If you have any questions, ask them down below or on the Facebook page. And, as always, stay creative.